I'm so excited to be talking about this book. It is really one of the most gripping novels that I've read in a really long time. It's absolutely spellbinding and so precise and so filled with care, careful in that sense. So I'm looking forward to kicking things off with Daniel doing a little bit of a reading, and then we'll get into a conversation.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks everyone at Malaprops for having me. So I'm just going to read the very opening of the book. I'd spent 8 years officially disappeared, at least as far as I knew. I hadn't been back to Argentina since '76, and even after the ostensible resumption of democracy in '83, no one from the government ever managed to confirm my existence. Only in the 9th year, when I married an American and had to get certain papers in order for my green card, did Tommaso Rija return to documented being. But the interval between wasn't merely a bureaucratic absence. I'd shut myself off completely until I met my wife, and even then, by our first anniversary, I was already sleeping on the couch. The affair was hers, but the fault, I acknowledged tacitly, was mine. I'd never been truly present. Kind and available, yes. Committed to. Even making plans for the long term. A joint savings account, my citizenship application, and most recently, conversations about children. But it was always an effort, a mask I put on. If I blamed Claire for anything, it was that she saw it for what it was and let me wear it anyway. That's one reason I went back when I got the call Pichuca was dying. It would mean a break from our problems. But like all things, it was a combination, a messy one. The timing contributed. Presumably, it would be safer for me in Argentina now, 3 years into non-military rule. So did the fact that my work was portable. The notorious lure of the past, especially amid all that secretly uncomfortable talk of the future, was certainly part of it as well. There was also the call itself. Pichuca made it unassisted, rambling half-intelligibly through a patchy connection that left her sounding older than her 60 years and a good deal crazier. Not at first, when she told me it was pancreatic cancer and she had little time left, nor when she gave me the logistical details I needed in order to visit. But at the end, when she told me over an increasingly scratchy line that Isabel could come back as well, despite the fact that Isabel had been disappeared as long as I had. I chalked up the delusion to Pichuca's illness, but the idea still held symbolic appeal, the kind to do with closure and redemption, putting stubborn ghosts back in their graves. Only when I hung up did I wonder. My departure from the country had been almost traceless. I left behind no forwarding address or number. I didn't notify anyone, regrettably not even my mother, who died several weeks later. How Pichuca had found me, how anybody could have, was a mystery. A small one, maybe. Getting those citizenship forms in order had led me to fill out others, and more paths to me had opened up than I liked. There were census questionnaires, banks and lawyers contacting me about my mother's unclaimed assets, and requests for an interview from CONADEP, the country's newly founded commission investigating the military government and disappeared persons. Their inquiries had been the most difficult to navigate, as Claire had seen one of the envelopes. She knew more than the broad contours with which most Americans were familiar. Cold War, US-backed authoritarian regime kidnapping and killing tens of thousands at will in the name of fending off communism. She was aware of my time in detention, had heard me recount certain nightmares and encouraged me to confront them. Yet my honesty with her remained selective, and the full, fleshed-out story still wasn't one I was eager to examine, much less hand over. The point is, I could reason out ways of tracking me down if I tried, but mostly they involve big investigative bodies and the kind of resources someone like Pichuca would never have had at her disposal. So the question of how she managed it proved to be its own draw. And though I could have called back, she told me what hospital in Buenos Aires she was in, the room number as well. I didn't. Instead, I simply told Claire my plans and booked my flight and hotel. but I must have had at least a hunch that the borders I'd cross on this journey weren't the standard ones. Since on a semi-conscious whim I told myself was purely nostalgic, I wound up packing, stuffed into the bottom of my suitcase as if I were hiding it, the fake passport the colonel had given me when I fled from Argentina, now almost exactly a decade before.
Thank you so much. That's such a great opening, and it sets up what's about to happen so well. I was wondering if you could start by saying a little bit about why you came to this story, how you came to this story. As I mentioned, it felt so gripping to me. So I wonder kind of where that sense of urgency came from for you.
Yeah, so this is a story set in 1986, 10 years after the military dictatorship in Argentina began, what's known to most people as the Dirty War. And it's the story of someone returning to basically confront his past, the protagonist I just read from Tomas, and also to search for the ghost of a woman he was in love with 10 years before, who was killed by the regime, named Isabel. And the character of Isabel, who in the book is fighting against the dictatorship. First, it seems just as a young student engaged in political activism, and later as it's revealed as someone in the armed resistance against the dictatorship. She was inspired by my half-sister Isabel, who fought against the regime the way the character did, and was disappeared by the military in 1978. And she was sort of a ghost in my household growing up. I never knew her. She was killed 10 years before I was born. For various reasons, most of which are summed up best just by the word pain, she was not talked about by my family very much. She sort of, her shadow lurked in the background. And so when in some ways, it doesn't always feel like a choice that I wrote this story. It was, I had wanted to write something around her, let's say, since starting in like 2014 or 2013 maybe. And she was a central figure in, not really in my life growing up, but certainly in the background of my life. And I struggled for a really long time to figure out how to do so, until I came up with the story that sort of was true to my own emotional experience around this, which was the story of someone searching for a ghost, which is sort of what I felt like growing up, and engaging in this investigation of who this person I didn't know was. It was sort of a search for a ghost. So that was how I came to it.
Okay. And I think another thing that you do in this character of Isabel is really maintain this mystery. Like, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how Tomas feels about Isabel and what kind of lure she has for him.
Yeah, so they are, in the story, childhood friends at first. They meet because their mothers are friends, and they spend summers together at this beach house. And Isabel is a kind of rebellious figure, even as a young 13-year-old, 15-year-old. God, I don't remember how old she is when the book starts. But she's older than Tomas, is what is important. And he looks up to her. She's also, beautiful, very full of personality. And Tomas is shy and doesn't have such strong principles. And, they're kids, and he's never met anyone like her. But later that love doesn't really necessarily transform, but the circumstances around it do during the dictatorship. He knows she's politically active. He knows she has strong principles, as I said, but he doesn't know what she is doing exactly, what she is up to. And it sort of comes to light gradually as she pulls him closer, because she has her own intentions for him to join her cause. And Tomas doesn't always know where he stands with her. He knows he's in love with her. He knows they have a very old closeness. They used to be lovers when they were kids. But he doesn't know really what is going on behind, in her head in present day. And I think in part, not to bring everything back to my own personal background here, but again, the figure of my half sister Isabel was a mystery for me for much of my life. And so, I think that is how that came to be for Tomas as well in many ways.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit before we went live about the many ways that this book can be interpreted as potentially a ghost story or more of a psychological thriller or love story. And it's striking me now that, you mentioned in the first chapter that Claire has been unfaithful to Tomas, but actually one interesting thing that you do, one of the many really interesting things that you do by setting it 10 years after kind of the main action of the book, is almost set up a little bit of a triangle. Maybe I'm partly thinking of this because of the book that we're working on together, Pedro's book, which is all about an affair, as is so much of his work. But do you think that there's also this kind of larger tension for Tomas between this mysterious person and this person who's very much on the earth and very real, and he shares kind of the most mundane moments with this American wife?
Definitely. I mean, Isabel was always a mystery to him. He knew her in some ways as well as anyone, but she always kept things from him, even when they were young. And Tomas, when the story begins, Tomas has been in sort of a forced kind of exile for 10 years. And, I described the book as his search, going back to Buenos Aires to search for the ghost of Isabel. But in some ways you could almost say, he himself left something behind. He is sort of a ghost in his own life. And I do think that, he tries to conceal his past from his wife, Claire. He does not let her in. He doesn't really want to be known at that point. And I think he's drawn to Isabel in large part, drawn back because, not necessarily that she was the person who knew him best, because, in some ways his wife Claire knows him better, in the sense that, when you live with someone, all the mundane things that, there's a line in the book about how, Claire knew that Tomas didn't do a good job drying his back after a shower, and that kind of intimate little detail that he never really had with Isabel. But when he was with Isabel, life was full of passion, full of high stakes, often stakes that turned violent or dangerous as time wore on, but it was full of life. And with Claire, he doesn't really feel much life at all. He feels like he left his life behind in Argentina and is in some ways seeking that out as much as Isabel.
Hmm. And it also feels like he's feeling torn, at least subconsciously, between the comforts of life in the United States and the excitement of life in Argentina. I wanted to ask you too about your own experiences living in Buenos Aires, which I know you did. And you have some beautiful, beautiful descriptions of the city that also get at some of the problems that you then delve further into as the novel progresses. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what the place means to you.
Yeah. it's sort of complicated because I had never been to Argentina until 2010, though my father is Argentine. I grew up going to Uruguay, where we still had family, and we had a little bit of family in Argentina, but very little, and it was a place of painful memories from my father, and we didn't go. And so, somewhat on a whim and like, a kind of post-college typical way, I was like, I must find myself or whatever. And I wanted to connect to this country I had heard so much about and identified as, I identified as Argentine, but I'd never even seen it. And so on a bit of a whim in some ways, I decided to just move there, to live there after I graduated from college. But I didn't have much family there. I didn't know anyone there when I moved to Buenos Aires. And while I did meet people and had friends, in some ways it was a really lonely experience. I mean, or at least a very solitary experience. One in which, a lot of my time was spent just walking, just sort of hanging out, immersing myself in just the surroundings. Part of that was a choice in some ways. I'm sure I could have been more social if I wanted to, but and I found Buenos Aires to be a city of contradictions from the beginning. On the one hand, there's a lot of sadness in Buenos Aires. People, tango is the music of Buenos Aires. People have all this nostalgia and this like pain, and everyone's very dramatic. But on the other hand, everyone has a ton of fun. Everyone is sort of living life to the fullest. The most, you party till 5 a.m., whatever, and drink red wine and eat red meat. And those are sort of like the highlights of the week. And in some ways, those sets of contradictions in Buenos Aires were the ones that, were navigating these contradictions as someone sort of living alone there and living a somewhat solitary existence. I think that part was what really ends up in Hades for Tomas, which is, he moves to Buenos Aires as just a year younger than I was when I moved there. I was basically a college kid. And on the one hand, he sees all this life around him. He lives with other students. He's partying with Isabel and all of this stuff. But on the other hand, there's this undercurrent of pain, in that case, political oppression, but his own pain. He's also in love with someone he's not sure is in love with him. And I just found the like layers of this city tantalizing in this way, I still don't know even today if someone's like, is Buenos Aires a happy place or a sad place? It'd be hard for me to answer. And I kind of love that about it in a weird way.
Yeah, that makes me want to read a paragraph, and just holding up this very beautiful book so everyone can see it and place their orders. So you say on page 34, the swaying greenery and Parisian architecture, those charming specialty shops like umbrella stores, the city remained completely unmarred by what happened within it. Buenos Aires never showed its scars, never let its surface be ruffled. It was a city made for forgetting as much as for nostalgia. And capture that contradiction so perfectly. And if I could ask you to read a very short passage on 91 at the top, you heard rumors. I feel like that will continue in this vein.
Yes. Just that paragraph, or
maybe the
you stop me when you're ready. You heard rumors. Someone hadn't been heard from in a couple of days, hadn't shown up at home either. Someone else, a professor, had suddenly taken a post abroad. In Mexico, the tale usually went, but occasionally there were more outlandish destinations like Switzerland or Norway. You remembered the stories parents told kids about how an aged dog had been taken to some Arcadia in the country where it could run free, and you wondered if these tales were like that. The one thing you never heard were the shots. For all the talk, death and violence and war remained off screen. But the forces behind them seemed no less powerful for that. To the contrary, they had more the aura of magic as a result, a sorcerer's unstoppable reach. Again, if I startled when the colonel gave me his revolver, it was probably less because of the gun itself than because against such invisible might, it seemed a puny, pointless sort of shield.
Thank you. I mean, so maybe you could talk just a little bit more too about the particularities of this dictatorship, in case anybody is unfamiliar with these kinds of tactics. Maybe you could say a little bit more.
Yeah, so the dictatorship was a military dictatorship backed with U.S. support that, you know, in the name of fighting communism during the Cold War, was kidnapping people of their, largely just of their choosing, and torturing them to find other supposed political dissidents and disappearing them, killing them in such a way that the bodies are not recovered and there was no documentation as to what happened. Often in Argentina, that meant being dropped from planes into either the ocean or the Rio de la Plata. And what was particularly striking in many ways about the way Argentina engaged in this state-sponsored terrorism speaks in many ways to the both that passage and the contradictions we were talking about in the city of Buenos Aires, which is that a lot of these torture centers, detention centers they were called, but they were torture centers, were operating in the heart of the city on these gorgeous blocks. The ESMA, this naval academy where there were many years of torture, is on this very famous street, and there are these white columns, and you look through the gates and it just is gorgeous. It looks like a Ivy League university. And Automotores Orleti, the detention center featured most of all in the novel, is next to a school, next to a train station. There are people living extremely normal lives all around what is happening in this detention center. And people, in somewhere else in the book I say, you saw but you didn't see in Buenos Aires at this time. People knew what was happening, or a lot of people did, but they didn't want to see, or they didn't acknowledge it. They were sort of passively complicit. And yeah, and I'm going to, my first event, I got cat bombed during a Zoom, and now I'm getting package bombed. I can hear someone at the door. Hold on, just one quick second. And we're just gonna hope that it doesn't cause too much of a disruption. Isn't this fun?
Yeah, I like it. It makes things so much more exciting than that.
It's true. This wouldn't happen in a bookstore, but so ignore sounds of doors and such things. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting feature. You know, you have this constant slipping in and out of past and present, and then you also have this slipping in and out of us and them. Like, who's a torturer and who's not a torturer? And I think one of the things that your book handles so brilliantly is that line just kind of begins to dissolve. And I think, you do such a great job of suggesting this weight of these mental gymnastics that are being performed by people who are continuing to just like live their lives, even though that actually like people were super preoccupied with what was happening. But you have this great scene of people just passing by someone being beaten on the street and not even looking because it's safer for them to do that.
Yeah, and I think with the torturers themselves, this was something that I really thought a lot about in writing the story. The ways that people sort of who are living an otherwise seemingly normal life, you know, whether they have family or they root for a soccer team or they, you know, whatever they do, sort of the way they switch on or off and entering a torture center to be a torturer. Some of them, you know, basically are other, you know, like good. I don't want to say they're good people, but they live an entirely separate existence that has nothing to do with what they're doing in this place. And I wanted to show that people can, how a bad system or a bad place like this, a truly evil place like this, forces the people who enter there to become evil in ways that elsewhere in their life they might not be. And this is seen most of all, of course, in the character of Tomas, who, spoiler alert, is asked by Isabel as part of the resistance to spy on a torture center, to work at a torture center as a spy. And that slippage you're talking about, where you don't know what side of good and evil you're on, is he lives that very intensely. You know, he goes there to do a good thing, to provide information for the resistance, but day to day is complicit with what is happening with the torture itself that's being done.
What was it like for you to inhabit that world as you were writing this book? I mean, what is it like to think about torture all day?
It's weird. It's hard. You know, in many ways, that was the aspect of the book I probably researched most heavily, by which I mean, you know, I tried to read as many firsthand accounts of survivors of this experience as I could, because, of course, you know, I am living a very safe existence, and understanding something like that, I didn't feel equipped to do it. And every time entering Automotores imaginatively was a bit of a mental leap. And, you know, I felt, I mean, in some ways, you know, what was fortunate in some ways about the story that I told was that Tomas, who is our, you know, lens onto this place, isn't prepared for what he sees. And he is not a victim at first. He sort of enters as largely an observer. He's not engaging in torture himself. He's sort of just, he's there as you know, he's a medical student, so he's there as a doctor for the place. And he is not prepared for what he sees, and the pain of what he sees was often like the pain of what I felt in reading about these things. You know, some of the accounts were just horrifying to such a degree that, you know, even if Tomas isn't participating in what he's viewing, just by viewing these things, it really destroys him, and it makes him feel guilty. It makes him feel like he's not doing enough to stop it. And I think, you know, especially as someone living in the US, which is, you know, a country that can be very complicit in such things around the world, you know, that guilt of complicity is one that I feel a lot of us can probably relate to.
Mm-hmm. And so what did you feel like your responsibility was as a person who is half Argentine, half US? What were there things about this dirty war that you felt like you absolutely had to include? And were there things that you felt like just like, I can't do this for personal reasons, or because I don't think it would be responsible to kind of duplicate this horrific component?
Yeah, when I was first thinking about writing a book, you know, all my earliest attempts at telling a fictional story inspired by my half sister Isabel, for a very long time, none of those stories included a torture center. That was not part of the plan. I wanted, in the way that is sort of described in that passage that you had me read, I wanted to do sort of what I think was, for most people, the account of that time, or their own experience of that time, which is that the violence was off screen. They didn't see it. They chose not to see it. They chose to look the other way. And for a period, I was engaged in the exact same thing. I wanted to tell the story of someone falling in love with a montanera, with someone in the resistance, and who was in college and just trying to live a normal life, but sort of gets wrapped up in that, it gets entangled in that because of her. I did not think that he was going to get entangled in a torture center. But as I read more and more about the period, I think, sorry, I'm jumping around a little, but that word most frequently used to describe what happened to victims of the regime, to be disappeared, which was what happened to my half-sister, to be vanished, to be killed and vanished. It's so all-encompassing that what preceded that disappearance is often not really reckoned with. These victims weren't simply murdered. They were often tortured beforehand. And these places, we often, the worst crime we often think of when thinking of, state terrorism is the crime of murder, of death. But there's so much more that happens, and that happened in Argentina. Yeah, I guess at a certain point, I just felt the responsibility to tell that part of this story, which I hadn't read much of in the fiction around this period that I knew of, and I didn't know that much about it. And sorry, again, this is the longest answer to this question, but I think it goes to show that, when I was living in Argentina in 2010, a friend of mine in Argentine was talking to me and another expat, an expat was talking to me and a friend who was Argentine, and asked us, he was going to go see this torture center I mentioned, the ESMA. They had sort of turned it into a memorial museum by that point. He wanted to see what it was like. And he asked me and my Argentine friend, and my Argentine friend said, no, me da cosa, it gives me the creeps. And I didn't go either. Neither of us went. Neither of us wanted to see what had happened there. And, several years later, when I started writing this book, at a certain point, it became clear, like, I had to see what went on there and show it.
Did you go back to the site?
Yes, I went back to the ESMA. I went to, in some ways, as many of these centers in Buenos Aires as I could. I went to Automotores several times, and another one, the Olimpo.
And are those ones also kind of open to the public now?
Yes, they are, and that's a sort of recent development for a lot of them. Because a lot of these, one thing that's different about the outcome of the Argentine military dictatorship is, the military kept control of a lot of these places. You could argue kept control of the country for many years. And so a lot of these places weren't given over to the public until, I think Automotores, maybe in 2013, 2014, something like that, it was made available for viewing. And that may also be a reason that, until then I hadn't read much fiction that actually showed the insides of these places, because I couldn't see them. But so now they're memorials, basically, to tell viewers what had happened.
Mm-hmm. What about the difficulties of managing to find a language in English for this story that obviously is taking place largely in Spanish? I know you have Tomas mentioned that he feels like he is kind of living in translation at some point early on in the book. But how was that for you? Did you find that there was anything that you really struggled to render in English as you were going along?
I was excited to talk about this with you, since you are, of course,
of course, that will be my
a very good translator, and my father is a translator, from English to Spanish, and I the I mean, I think in some ways, before talking about the language itself, I think the translation of the emotional experience for Tomas as an Argentine living for 10 years in New York, a place he doesn't know well, a place he does not belong and have friends or family for a very long time there. And then for him to go back, a lot of, in an emotional sense, he's translating himself into different cultures, back and forth, and he's not sure anymore in which he belongs. And I think that, going to your initial question about Claire versus Isabel, he doesn't know which life he really belongs to. And in terms of the language, he writes in English, or I wrote in English, but he writes in English, and but he uses a lot of Argentine, or a lot of Spanish phrases and a lot of Argentine idioms. And part of that is just that there are certain and you know this very well as a translator, specifically of Argentine Spanish, that there's certain Argentinisms that you cannot, there is no translation for in many ways, and certain tendencies that there is no translation for. So, the classic example is the word boludo, which everyone uses to address everyone else, which means basically big bald person, but also literally means big bald person, means figuratively like idiot, but people just say it as in like, hey you, hey boludo, which somehow again conveys those contradictions in Argentine culture, I think. But there were things that I felt to write sort of an Argentine story, had to remain Argentine in language. The use of diminutives, I don't know if that's a specifically Argentine thing or a Spanish thing more generally, but I've always, it's something very interesting to me, and I'm getting a little in the weeds here, I realize, but that English language doesn't really have diminutive forms, whereas in Spanish, you can turn anything into, Tomas is always called by his mentor, the Colonel, Tomasito. He's never called Tomas. And that's true of all the torturers at the torture center, and don't really call him most of them call him Tomasito or Verdecito. They're sort of like calling him as a kid. And the amount of just, the ways that they make everything smaller, these huge things, someone's referring to what they called victims thrown from planes. In Spanish, they were called mojaditos, little wet ones, which is, when you think of what kind of victims we're talking about, to use a diminutive, cute, charming word for that is so astonishing. Anyway, all of this to say that I felt writing this weird, it's all in English, but with this little Argentine Spanish undercurrent was both true to, this Argentine story, but Tomas's emotional experience in particular.
Mm-hmm. No, and you're very attentive to language throughout, and especially to Spanish, and you also bring in some Spanish, right? And you kind of make sure to differentiate between what feels comfortable and what feels local and what feels weird.
My father, who did of his own volition and goodness, did a translation into Spanish, was very focused on which parts were Argentine Spanish and which parts were Spanish.
Like he consulted you about how to translate certain passages that weren't as marked in English?
Sort of. The character of the Colonel, this mentor of Tomas's, who is high up in the military and this sophisticated, charming, funny torture organizer, basically, always uses the curse joder, which is a Spanish curse. He's like very cosmopolitan, and no Argentine would have been using it at the time. So I don't know. I think a lot of these things, they're small little decisions, but I hope amount to a sense of flavor. That choice gives the Colonel a sense of this worldly flavor, that he is very proud of. He studied at the Sorbonne, whatever. And whereas for other characters, their Argentine Spanish is more, standard fare.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a brilliant move because it also makes these people feel so much more real. Because, I mean, of course, like if you think of American friends, there are some people for whom language doesn't register at all. And then there are others who use weird British things that who knows where they pick them up. And, others use archaic phrases and whatever. Like everyone has their own way of speaking. So I thought it was a really nice touch that you didn't just kind of make everyone be Argentine, whatever that would mean.
Thank you. Well, I mean, again, it's part of that is also just because Tomas no longer knows if he's Argentine, American. He sort of doesn't know where he belongs anymore.
Yeah. I think it's so cool that your father translated your novel. That's such an amazing kind of family story and a return home for him too, I would think, to go back, take this story back from English into Spanish.
Yeah, someone said to me that, because as I said, my father didn't talk to me much about my half-sister growing up, if at all, and there was a lot of silence around her. And my father's choice to do a translation of this book was sort of, in a way, I mean, it's fiction, it's not, my Isabel is very different from the real Isabel, her story is very different, all of these things, but that in a way it was a way for him to finally give voice to feelings, perhaps, and that he had not been able to put in his own language. I don't know. He's watching and probably shaking his head, thinking that's not true. But I like that interpretation very much. I especially because so much of this book for me was about bringing to life, so to speak, this person who was dead, and giving a memorial to someone who never got one. I mean, when you were disappeared, you're put in a common grave, and you're lucky if your family even knows, and you don't get a funeral at all. We were lucky that in 2019 we finally did have a ceremony for Isabel. But so anyway, that idea of doing a kind of memorial for her with this book was also obviously part of the hope.
Well, I think that's a beautiful way to end our conversation, at least temporarily, and we can turn it over to the people who are watching. If anyone has questions, I think we're going to be receiving those.
Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. What a wonderful discussion. And just a quick reminder that we do have copies of Hades Argentina in stock at the link that was provided, in case you haven't ordered it already. Hopefully this discussion convinced you if you haven't already. And we didn't talk much about Hoemsick at all, but we have copies of that available. And honestly, like as far as memoirs go, this is one you shouldn't pass up. In addition to La Uruguaya and the future English translation coming out in June. So I guess we'll start getting to people's questions. In the, let's see. Yeah, so you mentioned that your dad is translating the Spanish edition of Hades. Is there a planned publication date yet for that, or
not yet? We're hopeful and sort of still sorting out the details around that. It's a bit complicated, especially in Argentina, because as people may know the economy in Argentina is difficult right now, and publication details like that are sort of tough to make happen. But we're working on it, and that would be the dream. It is important to me. Hopefully, one day that this book be read in Argentina.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So here's a question about you as an editor, being edited. What was that transition like for you, moving from your role as editor to writer?
I loved it. I think, one thing that was nice is because I'm an editor, I have made people do, acrobatic sorts of changes to their work, revise the ending, take out this character, whatever. I was not frightened of getting large-scale feedback like that. I was excited about it often. It was sort of, I think, especially when people suggest like cuts or something, that can feel like, for first-time authors, often very constraining. Oh, you want to, put this game, always sort of gave the imagination a bit of a boost. And yeah, I loved it. I mean, I think this is in a different way why the MFA workshop model is how it is. You learn as much about your writing from editing as you do from writing. So
yeah, for sure. At least from my perspective, when I was reading it, it felt like, in a way that I don't think I was able to really articulate, it seems like there's something about it that feels very Argentinian, whatever that monolith is of Argentinian literature, while also being very North American somehow. It felt like a very smooth marriage of two literary traditions. What are some, I guess, North American authors and Argentinian authors that you felt kind of live in the shadows of this book?
God, it is a strangely difficult question. You'd think that I had all my Argentine authors in the background. In some ways, I mean, to be candid, I'm not as much of a connoisseur of Argentine literature as I should be, given that I'm half Argentine. The larger influence of magical realism definitely was there, not necessarily as a model. Garcia Marquez is not a model for me. I have a very different approach to supernatural things, but the permission given by a literary movement that blends the magical and the real gave me permission to write this book. But I think the Argentine personality, in some ways, the cultural personality is, I hope, infused in the book in the way you mentioned. And that's not always just about literature. I mean, tango plays a big role in the book. The spirit of, that music is so full of love and nostalgia and reminiscences about the past. And in the most famous tango, possibly, you could argue, is Volver by Gardel, which is all about returning to a place where one was in love. And, that's very much the beating heart of this book. So, I would say that, and I will mention, before getting to North Americans, one Spanish language author that did very much influence this book in a way, though first in the background and then more and more in the foreground as I thought about it. It's a writer, a friend of mine, sort of pointed it out to me and reminded me how deep the influence was, which is Juan Rulfo's Pedro Páramo, which is about someone returning to, or going to a ghost town to seek out his father. And then on the, in terms of North American authors, it really runs the gamut. I mean, Donna Tartt is one of my biggest influences, which may seem strange, but linguistically, because we're sort of different kinds of authors, but linguistically, she's, to me, one of my favorites, and the way she creates suspense. Ishiguro is sort of the master for me of regret, and this book is a lot about regret, and he, is someone I really look up to. And then I would say, I'll try to be very quick. actually a couple of specific books that had a big influence on this were Exit West by Mohsen Hamid, who I'm lucky to have the same editor as, the way he blended, sort of used a magical device to tell a very real, politically relevant story in Exit West. Sort of similarly, Underground Railroad was something in the back of my head, this railroad, turning it into a literal railroad. And then finally, I'll just mention Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmond Ward was again, a book with ghosts in and the way that political oppression and collective trauma can be sort of revealed by having ghosts play a part in the story had a huge impact on me as well.
Right. Yeah. And it was specifically for that I really thought more of Liliana Hecker. She was sort of the first writer that came to my mind, that kind of, national trauma played out through a relationship. And Fernando Buttazzoni, the Uruguayan writer who does the same thing. Yeah. There's another question about sort of what sounded like a pretty traumatic experience of immersing yourself in the torture and the violence and all that. How have you been going about coming out of that, retracting from that, putting some distance from that?
The publication process is so long that, even though the book is just coming out now, in some ways I stopped working on it, writing it in the end of 2019, I guess. And so in some ways I've had a long kind of runway off of that experience, but I don't know. I sort of sometimes, some of those things are still very much in my head. Obviously in watching the news and a coup attempt, watching news of children kept in cages, they're sort of knee-jerk reactions that bring me back to thinking about this period and what I read about. And then I don't know. It's sort of hard. You don't always know how much of this enters your bloodstream. And I'm sort of, I think, I think one thing that even in engaging and writing on it, in the same way that I was describing how torturers sort of have to put on, not necessarily a mask, it's who they are, but sort of they switch on to an extent, they switch off. Maybe they're always the torturer at heart, whatever it is. But for the character of Tomas, he has to engage, not engage. He engages in a lot of denial at times, tries to rid his memory of these things, sometimes looks at it straight ahead. And I think that's true of being a writer dealing with these things. You enter the imaginative torture room in the story on a much more micro level, doing the same operation. You are, switching on, switching off, and I guess in a way I could say currently the switch is off. If I were to go back to Argentina, but I know if I went back to Argentina, I haven't been able to because of the pandemic. I know that every single time I go back now, I will go to Automotores Orleti and I will look at that place. So, how much it's in the background, but if I want to look at it, I know I can still see it there very vividly.
I guess I would sort of like to ask the same question of Jennifer, the one that was posed earlier about transitioning in roles. Since the two of you sort of represent an interesting kind of trifecta of relationships, editor, translator, writer, editor turned translator, turned writer, writer turned etc. So Jennifer, how have you experienced transitioning roles?
I think for me, it's very hard. It's all consuming when I'm inside a book, and it really doesn't matter. I think of translation as writing as well as I think a lot of translators do. So on one of my recent translations, which is a very long, very kind of emotionally grueling book, especially as it has ramped up and you're getting to like page 700, 800, whatever. And I just found that, you know, I was crying as I was translating. Like there's some things that are just so awful. And by that point, you know, the characters so well. And it's really difficult for me to just, I can't like dip in. I can never work on 2 translations in one day, for example. Like once I'm in that world, I'm really in it and it is real to me. And, you know, people always want to compare translation with something like a performance of some kind in order to understand it better. And I do think that there's something to the comparison of acting. And I think that there might be some actors who kind of, well, obviously there's like this method approach where you're really that character for a while. And it can be, yeah, for me, it can be really hard.
Yeah, interesting. I guess this is a good question to wrap up on for Daniel again. In what ways do you think your book fits in or doesn't with the Argentine Gothic tradition? I guess maybe in a way, do you see this book as an Argentinian book?
In some, I mean, I don't want to say no outright because it seems weird that a book called Hades, Argentina wouldn't necessarily fit into an Argentine literary tradition. But, you know, I think this is a reference to a review that said it, you know, fell into the Argentine Gothic tradition. I didn't really know what that meant when I saw it. I didn't know, you know, I know that there's a lot of like ghost figure in Argentine literature, but I didn't know that there was sort of a more specific genre of that. And so in a way, the answer is just it doesn't fit into it. But I'm sure, you know, stories enter you in oblique ways. You know, I experienced that very much with my half sister, who I never talked about, but she entered me obliquely. And literary traditions often do the same thing. I may not have read that much Argentine literature, at least given again that I'm half Argentine, but my father, for instance, did. Family members did. And you talk to those people and you talk to them about what art should be or how story should work, or they like other things. And those are the ones they bring up. And the influence, even if once removed, still gets to you. And I think also there's the piece of, you know, there are certain writers who influence you who were influenced by, you know, by writers that the first person may never have read. And so, you know, it's a weird thing thinking about how Hades fits into the Argentine literary tradition because, you know, like Tomas in some ways, you know, I don't know where I belong in terms of literary traditions. You know, I mean, for him, it's about physical places. For me, it's about, well, both physical places, nationalities, and literary nationalities. You know, I don't know, I mean, I'm an American citizen. I don't often view myself that way and view myself more Argentine, but I hadn't been there till 2010. And you come around things in very indirect, long routes sometimes. And so basically, I don't know where in the tradition, which tradition this belongs to. I think when you're a child of immigrants and there are different generations of immigrants and all these influences mixing, I think we'll increasingly see that kind of thing happen where people won't know what tradition they belong to anymore.
Yeah, I wanted to just throw in before we end. I mean, in a way, that question, it's always interesting to hear what people's influences are, but it is not as though Argentine writers are only reading Argentine writers. You know, they're very, the people that I am friends with are really influenced by American literature too. And, you know, Faulkner or whatever would be an influence on these supposedly Argentine Gothic writers. So Yeah, I think Daniel's answer makes such great sense, because increasingly those national borders are as slippery as a lot of the distinctions that exist in your novel.
Yeah, and I'm going to chime in one more for that. It's just to say that Borges, who many people sort of consider like the father of Argentine literature, at least in a modern sense or whatever. And some people may find this appalling, but he loved English language writers, some Robert Louis Stevenson, H.G. Wells. He was sort of a and so that same circular influence is happening there. And I think it's a very weird thing. I think maybe there are different kinds of writers, but many of them, even if they pretend to know where they come from, probably don't.
Right. Yeah, and I think that those sort of national, traditions, as we say, are sometimes sort of more stultifying than they are reifying, let's say. Wow, yeah. Well, thank you again. I think that we're out of time now, unfortunately, though I'm sure we all wish we could listen to you guys at infinitum. Just once again, this is your reminder to order Hades Argentina from the link that we sent you, and Hoemsick from the other link. So thank you again to Daniel and Jennifer on behalf of Malaprop's bookstore, and thank you to everyone who came tonight.
Thank you so much.